Growing up with my primary hobby being arcade and home gaming, I've often been surrounded by family and friends that share many of the same interests. During the 16-bit era, the Sega Genesis had garnered a dedicated following in my circle of friends, with Sega's arcade and sports games being particularly popular, and exclusives like Revenge of Shinobi, Castle of Illusion, and Rambo 3 all being a big topic of conversation at school. Those that had yet to take the plunge with the Genesis were often NES fans that were still enjoying games that were hitting that platform. But a clear divide had formed. There were Sega kids, and then there were Nintendo kids. Whether by preference or circumstance, these divides solidified into full-blown hostility with many that I knew. The Sega kids were staunch in their belief that the Genesis was the clear choice, both in hardware power and game quality. The NES fans I knew were often satisfied with the NES's large, diverse library and its immense popularity. Things went on like that for a while. My friends and schoolmates often bickered about what was better. The funny thing was that most of the Sega kids had been NES kids only a year or two before. They had been jumping for joy at telling others about how awesome games like Zelda, Contra, Castlevania, Mario, and countless others were. They gleefully shouted their love for the NES and its games, and Nintendo was simply the best thing ever. It all changed once their ownership of Sega's console began, and as the Genesis grew in popularity, so did their disdain for the other systems. I tried to always remain neutral among my friends while this was developing. While my NES had fallen to the back burner during the initial rise of the Genesis, I had always found reasons to return periodically to enjoy something that only the NES had available. My preference had always been Sega, but many of the games on the NES had no direct equivalent on Sega's offerings. I never met this reality with jealousy, disdain, or aggression. The variety was welcome, and I just tried to find the time to play it all. Of course, the shit literally hit the fan late in the summer of 1991 when Nintendo launched its new 16-bit system, the Super Nintendo, in North America. My friends had always been vicious in their attacks on how much more powerful the Genesis was than the NES, making sure everyone knew how great its games looked and sounded in comparison. The Genesis had been on the North American market for 2 full years when the Super Nintendo showed up, however, giving Nintendo ample time to develop a machine that had technical advantages over Sega's now veteran offering. Of course, this reality only served to strengthen the resolve of my Sega pals, with them now doubling down on the Genesis library, the faster CPU, and the word that the initial batch of Super Nintendo games suffered from severe slowdown. In those early days, the new adopters of the Super Nintendo were ready for the fight though. The retorts were often centered on the superior color palette of the Super Nintendo, the custom sound chip that could reproduce real instruments, and the newfangled Mode 7 effects. The arguments and discussions at the school lunch table and on the bus were fierce, with neither side given an inch. Before I continue, it's really important that you first know what kind of gamer I am. I was and always have been an arcade-first kind of guy. I enjoyed the technical spectacle that these games often were. I never minded the extreme difficulty, and I loved the fact that most of these games were easy to pick up and play, and didn't need a ton of time investment to realize what the hell was going on and have a bit of fun. The Genesis had been a natural fit for me in this regard, and its library had always given me exactly what I needed and wanted from a video game system. I had gotten the Super Famicom before the North American launch, as my natural disposition of not hating Nintendo had developed into full-blown curiosity in the months leading up to its release. A number of coming soon games had caught my attention in magazines, so I decided to take a slow approach to building my library. My focus remained primarily on the Genesis, but when Super Nintendo games became readily available in North America and new games began coming out, I was working a decent paying job, so I redirected some of my funds into increasing my library of games for the system. I had been attracted to the Super Nintendo not because I wanted a replacement for my mighty Genesis. I had wanted it because it had experiences I couldn't get anywhere else. I was no stranger to Super Mario, of course, and Super Mario World was a damn fine entry into the series. Taking what was learned in the previous entries, Nintendo crafted a new world full of things to find, secrets to uncover, and new moves and power-ups to make Mario seem brand new all over again. I had heard a near constant chorus from my friends about the visuals of Super Mario World, and how they were a joke compared to Sonic on the Genesis. but I enjoyed the art style and colorful graphics. I loved the way it differed from Sonic as well. Where Sonic was a brand new series that had one game under his belt, Super Mario World had been an evolution of design across multiple outings. In effect, Super Mario World was supposed to be a different game, with radically different design elements. I never saw Sonic as an analog to Mario. They were very different games that wanted you to do very different things. Where Mario was slower and more methodical, it wanted you to look around, collect things, and find secrets. Sonic was about speed and the ease to pick up and play. Instead of one obliterating the need for the other, I saw them as complements, with both game styles strongly deserving some playtime. Super Castlevania IV was of course an instant favorite, continuing a tone and feel started on the NES with the 3 games I played the hell out of. I had imported it a few months prior to the North American launch from Japan, so I had already experienced its incredible presentation, graphics, and music. While it definitely was easier than previous entries, I never saw this as a negative, mainly because I enjoyed having an adventure where my vampire killer was overpowered and the minions of Dracula never really having a chance against me. The second quest added a bit of challenge anyway, and with the game being as good as it was, replaying the adventure was no problem at all. The Genesis also lacked a Castlevania game to call its own in those early days. Frankly, the Super Nintendo was worth owning for this game alone. My purchase of Final Fight was all about my arcade fix, and I had been a big fan of the coin-op. The Super Nintendo did a bang-up job on the port too, with large characters, great color, and a fantastic soundtrack. Sure, it was nowhere near arcade perfect, and the lack of 2-player co-op and the absence of Guy was a hell of a blow, but it was the only avenue I had to play it. The Sega CD version was still a ways away, and even with Streets of Rage being a great Genesis beat-em-up, this game had its own unique feel, challenge, and gameplay. I played the absolute hell out of it. F-Zero had been the surprise of my initial batch of games though. I had wanted a game that showed off Nintendo's Mode 7 effects, and the game magazines had spoken highly of it. But this gem was something special. You only had a choice of a few vehicles, but that was made up for by the awesome track selection, incredible music, and the fact that I had never played a game that looked or ran like it. Mode 7 created a really impressive 3D feel to the visuals, and the smoothness of it was akin to Sega's mighty Superscaler games in the arcade. It was another compliment to the games I had experienced on the Genesis, offering me something I couldn't get anywhere else. So impressed was I with Mode 7, I immediately picked up Pilot Wings, another game that used it heavily. I was again treated to the type of game I couldn't get anywhere else. Basically, this was little more than a tech showpiece for the Super Nintendo, but the gameplay hook is so fun, it easily justifies its existence. Most of the game consists of obstacles you must get through to move on to the next level. These consist of things like skydiving, flying a plane, and using a rocket belt. It simulates 3D gameplay incredibly well for a game in 1991, and though it's pretty simple in execution, remains really fun today. Out of left field was ActRaiser, an experience that blew my socks off. It exemplified the difference between the thinking of Sega, Nintendo, and their third parties. While Sega and its licensees were arcade-centric in regards to game design that was fast, fun, and replayable multiple times in succession in those early days, Nintendo and many of its developers focused primarily on home content that featured longer-term gameplay hooks. ActRaiser took the tried-and-true platformer and added a mini RPG game all around it. In between the traditional action, you got to build towns, help your people prosper, and deal with the countless hazards that would befall them. The developer Enix even managed to fit in some action into this part of the game, giving you control of a guardian angel to do direct battle with the demons that infested your lands. The colorful graphics were show-stopping at times, and the soundtrack was like nothing I had heard before. Where the Genesis sound was synth-based and had its own unique feel and ability to add to a game experience, the replication of an actual orchestra here was different, again not replacing what the Genesis could do, but offering me something I simply couldn't easily get elsewhere. As with Final Fight, the Super Nintendo had a good choice of arcade-style games, so I made sure to pick up Gradius 3 when it hit. This classic continuation of the arcade series featured some of the very best music on the system in those first few months. I mean, this soundtrack is easily among one of my personal favorites, and one I listened to in the car quite a bit. It wasn't just a great sounding game either, with graphics that mimicked the arcade original quite well. While a full screen of enemies would often mean slowdown to contend with, the great color use and awesome special effects hold their own. It lacks the speed and intensity of Genesis shoot-'em-ups during that time, but offered enough content not normally seen in those games to stand on its own. Again, the Super Nintendo and Genesis complemented each other on a near perfect level. Pretty much everything I just said about Gradius 3 also applies to Super R-Type here. Great arcade action that comes with a top-shelf soundtrack and visual presentation. It again suffers slowdown, but many may actually find this helps the game's intense one-hit and restart difficulty. It wasn't available on Sega's 16-bit offering, adding yet another checkmark to the many reasons why supporting both systems was a must for those that had the means to experience the most from the hobby. Having been a big fan of Ghouls and Ghosts on the Genesis, I was excited to finally see the Super Nintendo's entry into the series, Super Ghouls and Ghosts. While sharing many attributes of the former, this new entry was quite a different experience. You'd lose the ability to fire upwards, but gain the ability to double jump, which quite literally changed everything about how you played it. Much of the graphics were designed to take advantage of the Super Nintendo's strengths, including some Mode 7 effects and lots of transparencies. Many people love to compare the two games as if they somehow make the other experience irrelevant. This is utter and complete BS, as these two games are different enough to warrant the time spent on each one. They are hard, both have their own unique look and sound, and the gameplay certainly is strong enough to say I'm glad I got to play them both around their original releases. The last game I want to go over is one that I feel gets so little love even among its own fan base, with its sequels often dominating the discussion. Final Fantasy II was an early Super Nintendo RPG that was actually the fourth in the Japanese series, but was renamed due to some of the NES sequels not making it out here. Basically a redemption story, Final Fantasy II is a charming tale of strong characters and relationships that are tested and strained while on a journey to discover much bigger truths than they ever thought possible. I find this to be one of the best told Final Fantasy stories, with a great cast that never fails to be interesting, and it never gets so complicated that you have no idea what the hell is going on like later entries into the series. Like many RPGs around this time, the visuals are rather simple, but they do include some great color and moments of Mode 7 special effects. The soundtrack makes excellent use of the Super Nintendo's hardware, being particularly impressive since the artist over at Square never had a chance to make a game for Sega's hardware. The best part was that as awesome as games like Phantasy Star 2 were on the Genesis, they felt nothing like this game. They had their own unique art styles, musical selections, and gameplay. Nothing displaced this, nor did this displace anything on the Genesis at the time. Having an open mind to access these types of unmissable experience didn't just give gamers like me the best viewpoints of the two systems, but also made me appreciate each individual game far more for its distinctive contributions. What all that means in the end is that the 16-bit generation is often labeled a war, a battle, or a conflict of sides and preferences. The two systems are often pitted side by side, with multi-platform games determining their worth in regards to graphics, sound, speed, and playability. I never saw it that way. I always looked at the Genesis and Super Nintendo offering up countless unique games I couldn't get anywhere else. I couldn't imagine in 1991 not being able to play Super Castlevania 4 or F-Zero, any more than I could imagine missing great Genesis hits like Road Rash or Streets of Rage. Further, if you really look at the best games on these two systems, they often are exclusive and couldn't be played anywhere else at the time. And even when a third-party multi-platform game did command the kind of attention to be mentioned among the elite, it was usually great on both systems anyway. You also need to consider that I've not even mentioned the fantastic PC Engine and TurboGrafx library here, which added even more must-play games to that generation. Instead of arguing my preferences and limiting my experiences, I chose to stay open and try to play everything I possibly could. I know that this isn't always something everyone can do all the time, but it has served me extremely well across many generations of machines. It's allowed me to not only have a fully formed opinion about things, but it's also opened me up to a world of games I may have never played otherwise. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.